Have you ever wondered why they don't teach basic personal finance in schools? Things like understanding taxes, debt, budgeting, investing. People and our nation would be so much better off. More people would be more rich. There'd be far fewer poor people, a lot more productivity, a lot less stress, healthier families, and overall, society would be much more free. Well, that last part is actually part of the reason. But to understand why, we've got to go back to the beginning. The idea of public schooling is actually fairly new in history. The Prussians were the first ones in modern history to adopt a government-run school system that was mandatory for all children to attend. This was back in the late 1700s, and the Prussians used this in order to create a society of soldiers. They wanted to train and brainwash their youth into being a military society. In order to do this, they designed specifically how the public schools would operate. They implemented things like uniforms, bells and buzzers to signal when kids needed to move from one place to the next, walking in line, standardized testing, and school buildings that looked and felt like military barracks. These are all things that still exist to this day in most modern public schools, and they were originally designed to train and brainwash kids into feeling comfortable with and viewing that military lifestyle as normal. Now, a few people, including the Rockefellers, saw this system and wanted to bring it back to the United States in the 1800s, but with a twist. Instead of having it produce military people, they wanted it to produce factory workers. And so over the course of a few decades, public schooling was rolled out across the United States with the express purpose of pumping out factory workers for the new industrial age. These included things like emphasizing standardized testing over original and critical thinking, emphasizing things like obedience over problem solving, and ultimately emphasizing certifications like degrees over competence. Now, you might notice that this system exists and persists to this day, despite the fact that we really don't have any sort of a real manufacturing base in the United States, and we don't need to be pumping out a bunch of factory workers. But the school system still to this day intentionally lacks things like training people about how the tax code works, about the usefulness and danger of debt, about basic things like even budgeting and the power of compound interest through long-term investing. And there are some major consequences that our society has today as a result of basically most Americans growing up and becoming adults and not having any basic understanding of personal finance. The number one catastrophic consequence of this is debt. The average American is $90,000 in debt. If you break it down by age, the group that is most in debt is Gen X at $135,000. The next group is baby boomers at $96,000. The next group is millennials at $78,000, and the silent generation at $40,000. And in last place with the least amount of debt is Gen Z with around $10,000. For most Americans, it is a crushing amount of debt. Nearly 1/3 of Americans have a net worth of $0 or less, and over half of Americans don't even know how to calculate their net worth. In addition, over half of Americans state that if they got an emergency expense of $1,000, they would not know how they would be able to afford it. Most Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, accumulating debt that they can't afford, and have a negative net worth that will prevent them from ever reaching financial freedom. And for most people, it's simply because they don't know the right thing to do. And some basic education at a young age would prevent this. So public schools, whose curriculum is designed by the government, why would they want this to be the case? Well, let's compare two people at the extremes. One person studies how taxes work, understands compound interest, understands investing, works really hard, saves all their money, invests all of it, builds a business, builds a fantastic net worth at a relatively young age, and retires early. Spends time with their family, does some traveling, and because of their business and their investments, they are able to not have to work a regular job for the rest of their life. Now you have person number two, who doesn't do any of that. They finish high school, then they go to college, then they get a master's, then they get a PhD. By the time they're done, they've got $150,000 worth of debt that they're going to owe for the rest of their life because they're never going to pay that off. And so they're not even going to try. They're just going to make the minimum payments on that. Now they also want a house because they did get a decent job, even though it's nowhere near enough to ever make a dent on their debt. So they get a mortgage, but they also now need a car because they've got a good job, but everybody else around them is driving nice cars. So they've got to go get some loans to get some nice cars for themselves too. A family emergency comes up about 5 years later and they don't have any money to cover it because every single dollar that they make from their decent job goes to pay all their debt payments for their things like their house and their cars and their student loans. And so in order to afford this emergency, they have to take out a personal loan or put it on a credit card. This doom spiral continues for the rest of this person's life, and they are never able to retire, even though they've built up maybe a couple $100,000 in their 401k. By the time they're 75, it's nowhere near enough in order to retire because they still have a bunch of debt. One day, this person has a heart attack in the office and dies, literally working to death. Question: which person benefited the US government more? Answer: the second person. You see, 52% of all of the money that the government gets from the taxes it takes comes from individual income taxes. And another 33% comes from the Social Security and Medicare taxes, which means that 85% of all tax revenue that the US government collects comes from your paycheck as a W-2 employee. This is because the entire tax code is not really about how to pay taxes. The tax code is about all the ways that you can avoid paying taxes. It is hundreds of pages of ways to get deductions and credits so you pay less in taxes. But guess what? Most people don't know what these ways are because most people don't pay attention to taxes, which is why the government gets all of their money from employees. The two most heavily tax advantaged people in the United States are investors and business owners. Basically, the entire Internal Revenue Code is written for those two groups of people. And that is because those two groups of people are what keep the economic engine running to make sure that everybody at least has a job. So they want to make sure that there's some incentive to make sure there's business owners and investors. But there are no real benefits tax-wise for employees, which is why the US government doesn't want most people to know about the tax laws because they would lose their tax base. Similarly, a nation of people who spends every single dollar they earn and goes into debt in order to spend more than the dollars they earn will be a nation of people that will be forced to stay employed for their entire life in order to continue paying for those things and all that debt. And if you're still an employee, you're still going to pay those taxes. So it is in the government's best interest to make sure that people do not understand basic personal finance, understand debt, understand investing, and understand the tax code. Otherwise, more people would be free. More people would be rich, less people would be poor, less people would be debt slaves, and then that means less people would be tax slaves. If you have kids, they are not going to learn about money from school. So here's what to do instead. Number one, you have to teach them by example. Especially when humans are young, we learn everything we know by watching the people we are closest to. And so if you are doing incorrect things with your money, it is very likely that your kids will grow up and do the same incorrect things with their money. If you get your own financial house in order, it's very likely that your kids will as well. Number two, talk about money in front of your kids and with them. Most families treat this as a taboo subject that you're not allowed to talk about. Maybe it's because a lot of parents are embarrassed about their financial situation, but for some people, it's because they don't want their kids to know how privileged they are. But if your kids never learn what it took for you to get where you are, or the mistakes that you made that led you to where you are, how do you expect them to avoid those same mistakes or to follow in your footsteps? Number three, instead of trying to protect and provide for your kids, try to prepare them through practice. In other words, as they grow older, you have to fail more and more so that they can learn to be equipped to provide for themselves. They can practice those necessary skills. Sometimes this means making your kids earn money and then making them buy their own things. Sometimes this means going door knocking with them so that they can practice selling things to strangers. Sometimes this means taking some of the money that they've earned from chores or from doing stuff for other people or selling things that they've created and making them invest it. And you'd be surprised how much kids will learn to enjoy these things because they think they're normal. My kids love going door to door and trying to sell things that they've made. My kids love buying silver, $20, $30 per coin, and seeing it come in the mail, and now they have something physical and tangible. Number four, read money books to them, or when they get old enough, have them read money books for themselves. A good place to start would be books like The Richest Man in Babylon. Now, finally, like I said in the beginning, you have to be able to teach by example here. And if you have no idea what to do with your money, how to invest it, how your investments should be allocated, I've created the perfect guide for you. It's called the Hedged Hypergrowth Portfolio Blueprint. It's linked in the description below. I'm raising the price soon, so get it before I do that. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.